Imagine being one of the biggest American music stars in the world. You arrive in Australia ready to perform for thousands of screaming fans. And suddenly, your entire tour is in danger because your tour buses are considered too big for Australian roads. Yes, seriously. Dolly Parton's Australian tour nearly became a disaster before she could even get properly started. And the strangest part? The person who helped save the tour was a man who would eventually become Australia's Prime Minister. So stay until the end, because the way this bizarre story ends is something you probably wouldn't expect. And if you enjoy discovering the strange, surprising differences between Australia and America, subscribe to Aussie Lens right now, because this is where we uncover the Australian stories Americans rarely hear about. It was 2011. Dolly Parton was preparing to return to Australia for her Better Day World Tour. And this wasn't just another celebrity appearance, it was a huge deal. Dolly hadn't toured Australia in 25 years. Australian fans had been waiting for decades to see the legendary American country singer back down under. More than 100,000 tickets were reportedly sold for the tour. Everything looked perfect. The American country music legend was coming back, the fans were ready, the concerts were planned, and the giant tour production was on its way. But then Australia basically said, "Hold on. Those buses aren't coming in." And that's where things got very strange. Dolly's entourage was traveling with two enormous tour buses, and Australian authorities had a problem. The buses were considered too long and too wide for Australian road requirements. Now imagine being Dolly Parton. You've performed around the world, you've traveled with massive productions. You've probably dealt with airports, customs, security, and countless logistical problems. But now you're in Australia. And apparently, the biggest obstacle between you and your concert isn't a rival singer, it isn't bad weather, and it isn't an injury. It's the size of your buses. Australian customs and road authorities had raised concerns about whether the vehicles could legally operate on Australian roads. And suddenly, a Dolly Parton concert tour had turned into a transportation problem. But here's where the story gets even stranger. Because the person who stepped in wasn't Dolly's manager. It wasn't a music executive, and it wasn't an American politician. It was Anthony Albanese, who at the time was Australia's federal transport minister. Today, most people know Anthony Albanese as Australia's Prime Minister. But back in 2011, he was dealing with a very different problem. He became involved in helping get Dolly's tour buses into Australia. According to Albanese's later account, he even went down to the airport and helped deal with the situation surrounding the vehicles. In other words, Australia had a transportation crisis involving Dolly Parton's tour buses, and a future prime minister was involved in solving it. Think about how ridiculous that sounds if you explain it without context. Dolly Parton's Australian concert tour almost collapsed. Why? Her buses were too big, and who helped? The future prime minister. You couldn't write this as a fictional comedy and expect people to believe it, but it actually happened. And here's where Dolly's reaction makes the story even better. Dolly Parton wasn't exactly furious about the whole situation. In fact, she turned the bizarre situation into a joke. During her Australian tour, Dolly joked about her appearance and even referenced the trouble surrounding her buses. But she also publicly thanked Albanese for helping make sure her buses could arrive. And Dolly being Dolly, she didn't simply say thank you. She joked that she would give him a very Dolly-style reward. She joked about covering him in lip gloss. That was the kind of personality Dolly had. A potentially disastrous logistical problem had turned into another unforgettable Dolly Parton story. But there's something else that makes this story fascinating. This wasn't just about two buses. Dolly's return to Australia was a major cultural moment. She hadn't toured the country since 1987, and Australian fans were incredibly excited to see her again. Her concerts were packed, and her music was already deeply familiar to Australian audiences. Songs like Jolene had become huge with Australian listeners. So when the tour was suddenly threatened by a problem involving her vehicles, it wasn't just a minor inconvenience. There were thousands of fans who had been waiting years for this moment. And that's what makes the story so strange. A global music superstar had made it all the way to Australia, only for a very Australian-sounding problem to get in the way. Road regulations. And this is one of those stories that perfectly illustrates something Americans sometimes find surprising about Australia. Australia can have very strict rules surrounding roads, vehicles, and transportation. Something that might seem completely normal in one country can suddenly become a regulatory headache somewhere else. To an American watching this story, the situation almost sounds unbelievable. Imagine telling someone, "One of America's biggest entertainers is coming to Australia. Great. But there's a problem. What problem? Her buses are too big. What? Exactly. And that's why this story became such a memorable part of Dolly Parton's Australian history. But there's actually something surprisingly wholesome underneath the weirdness. Dolly didn't leave Australia angry. She didn't turn the situation into some huge celebrity feud. She came, performed, entertained her fans, and continued doing what she had always done, turning awkward situations into stories people remember. And years later, Albanese himself would still talk about the bizarre episode. That tells you just how memorable it was. Because most politicians don't spend their careers remembering the time they helped a country singer get her buses through customs. But Dolly Parton isn't exactly most country singers. And there's one more reason this story feels almost too perfect. Dolly Parton's image is enormous. Big hair, big personality, big stage productions, big songs, and apparently, big buses. Australia had spent decades waiting for her return. When she finally came back, the country almost stopped her tour before it even properly began. But the buses eventually made it. Dolly performed. Australian fans got to see their country music icon again. And the strange little transportation crisis became part of the story. So the next time you hear someone say Australia and America aren't that different, remember this story. An American music legend arrives in Australia. Her tour is almost derailed. The problem? 2 enormous buses. The person who helps? A future Australian Prime Minister. And Dolly Parton's response? Basically, turn it into a joke. But here's the question I want to ask you. If Dolly Parton's buses were almost stopped because of Australian road rules, what other bizarre celebrity stories have happened down under that most Americans have never heard about? Because I have a feeling this isn't even the strangest one. Tell me your guess in the comments. And if you want more unbelievable stories that show just how different Australia can be from America, subscribe to Aussie Lens. Because the next Australian story might sound completely made up, but actually happened.